Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for taking the time to join today's research briefing on the right way to select web content management technology. We're excited to have our company founder, Tony Byrne, on the line with us, and he'll be joining us momentarily to walk us through some real updated techniques for making sure you're selecting the solution that is the right fit for whatever it is you're trying to do around web content management technology. A couple housekeeping items of note here as we get started. If you do have questions at any point during the presentation, please feel free to enter those into the questions tab and the GoToWebinar control panel. And also all of the attendees on today's webinar will be receiving the slides. And then those of you that are subscribers will actually be able to review a recording of the presentation in your subscriber library. Now, as we take a look at Real Story Group's coverage areas on our famous, or some may call infamous, vendor subway map, I wanted to point out a couple of quick things here. For today, we're going to be focusing on web content management, which is the blue line that you'll see running through the bottom on both the left and the right-hand side of the screen. Those are the vendors that we evaluate in this space, and that's what Tony will be touching on mostly today. The other item of note that's of interest that I wanted to highlight is that we will actually be adding another line to this subway map in the very near future, as CRM evaluations will begin to be part of our research portfolio. And if you'd like more information on that, certainly feel free to reach out to us after today's presentation. For those of you that are new to Real Story Group, I just wanted to provide a little bit more of a background about who we are as an analyst firm and what makes us different. So the approach that we've taken in our 16 years is unmatched in the research marketplace, in that we don't do any work for the vendors that we cover, nor do we accept any sort of a pay-for-play model to give any sort of preferential treatment within our research. And that means that you're going to get the real story, which is how we came up with the name, as to what the vendors are good at and what their strengths are, but probably more importantly, what are some of the pitfalls and what are some of the things that you'd like to avoid as you're looking to select the right solution for you. The other key aspect about our company is how we work with our customers, and that really takes a couple different forms. First and foremost is our research. Everything we do is based in our evaluations, and when it comes to web content management in particular, we evaluate 34 of the most prominent solutions worldwide, and you can subscribe to get an understanding of their strengths and weaknesses. You can also utilize our benchmarking tool called RealScore, where you can really assess where you're at from an effectiveness perspective, and then also benchmark yourselves against your industry peers. Finally, we do a select number of consulting projects come in throughout the year, where we can come in and act as an extension of your team, sit on the same side of the table as you're really helping to select a web content solution. Any of this info we're happy to share with you as well after today's presentation. But really what I want to do is turn things over to Tony, as he's going to walk us through what's the right way to select web content management technology.
Great, thanks, Scott. This is a subject, it's really near and dear to my heart. I founded CMS Watch a little bit more than 15 years ago because of really quadrants like this, and we saw companies making decisions based on kind of these generic assessments by major analyst firms, who was up, who was down, and very often they were making really poor decisions, overbuying technology, buying the wrong technology, buying web content and experience management systems in particular that were just a poor fit for them. And I thought to myself, there's got to be a better way to do this. That's why I founded CMS Watch. Been following web content and experience management systems ever since then. A lot of interesting changes over the last 16 years. Some things have stayed sort of the same, but it's a real passion of mine to evaluate these vendors, and a real joy to share a little bit of what we know with you today. Let's look at the agenda. One is, of course, the wrong way to select, which is just to use a kind of a horse race methodology. But we'll be a little bit more positive here going forward and talk about sort of WCM in the larger digital engagement context, where you are on the complexity spectrum, which is really important to understand. And then we'll take a look at the marketplace, including some trends, and then conclude the last 10 minutes with what's the right way to select this technology. So let's start out with a broader customer digital engagement reference model. We've been using this with a number of our subscribers, particularly our larger subscribers, as a generic reference model to begin to understand what are some of the capabilities that they need and how do they relate to each other. So this is a reference model. Obviously, that means that you then want to tweak it for your particular circumstances. But you'll see that web content management is really just one element at the engagement tier, sitting on top of an enterprise data backbone. And then obviously there's a number of production, interaction, delivery services as you push content and experience out through different channels. So it's really important to understand first and foremost, what's the context here, the broader context, and in particular, what services are you going to ask of your WCM as opposed to other systems? This is really important because a number of WCM vendors would have you do all of these things in purple, yellow, and blue here. In other words, also be your DAM vendor, your marketing automation, your social engagement. Very often you don't necessarily want to rely on the same vendor or even the same product to be doing these things. So really understanding the proper scope, and I would argue not having an over-expansive scope about what you're going to ask your WCM system to do, to really focus on the things that it's good at, and then relying on other tools in a more best-of-breed environment. Another way of putting this that we recently published was this notion of a MarTech Mall, that you have these anchor capabilities, of which WCM is an important one, but then there may be a variety of systems that it has to work with. And so obviously integration is an increasingly important consideration here. But just because WCM is just one anchor, it's by being an anchor, it's important. So you've got to really make a good choice here. And we find in particular, this is almost kind of table stakes as well, that you've got to have these anchors right before you go off and do other fancy stuff. And we see many organizations, including large enterprises, who are with an ill-fitting WCM platform, and they really suffer as a result. So definitely get the basics right, and that means getting the right WCM. And as you do that, one of the ways to then understand your needs in the marketplace as a whole is this spectrum of complexity. This is a similar spectrum you can find in a lot of technologies. We see it in spades in the WCM space. This notion that some offerings out there are more platform or even toolkit-like, while others are simpler and more product-like. So the more platform ones are fundamentally more customizable, more extensible, they're functionally richer, they're also more complex, they're going to take longer to deploy, and they're going to be more costly. They tend to demo very well, which is why people often favor platforms coming out of selection projects, but they don't always implement so well. So this is an issue for you to consider. We found historically over the last 16 years of watching this, the customers tend to overbuy rather than underbuy, but really kind of understanding realistically, where are you at on this spectrum and what can you handle and what do you have the resources to do is really important as you go about looking at your choices. We'll see in a minute here that you have a lot of choices, right? We cover about 36 major systems. We're always adding some, sometimes moving some. And what's interesting is that in general, the tools are becoming more complex. So, we make a distinction between platforms and products. And this year we kind of changed our nomenclature and sort of moved the bar a bit, dividing products from platforms over to the right here. And so what this means is everything to the left of this red line, you really want to have at least one developer in-house, ideally two or more. Everything to the right of this red line is a simpler product. You may or may not need an in-house developer. You could possibly just rely on some external support or so on and so forth. But the idea here is that in general, these tools are becoming more complex and, for better or worse, more developer intensive. The good news is they're also becoming richer and more capable. But then I'll turn your attention to the lower left, which are these sort of legacy platforms. These are some of the undead systems from some of the larger vendors. We're seeing these kind of disappear, not so much fall out of the market in as much as they're no longer available, but it's more no longer supported, but it's more like these are typically not systems that you would want to start fresh with, right? In other words, you wouldn't want to turn to SharePoint for a new WCM project. If you have SharePoint, or TeamSite or IBM for web WCM now doesn't mean you have to escape from that system, but it does mean that your future is likely to be fairly limited as those tools increasingly get deprecated. So what that leaves is sort of at the very highest end of the market, these so-called upper range platforms, exceptionally complex, somewhat expensive, very rich, they demo very well. And let's take a look at those, because what we see is interesting is a lot of upward pressure on these guys, a lot of emerging players and lower end systems that are pushing on them. This is good because it's driving a lot of innovation, but this also means that if you're looking at these top three guys up here at the top, Adobe, Acquia, Drupal, Sitecore, Core Media, you should also be looking at some of the lower end, simpler competitors as well, just to make sure that you round out the full breadth of possibilities for your team. Of course, there are some key trends here. One you've probably heard of is this whole notion of headless, which is essentially a web content management system that does not serve as a delivery environment. So it's delivery agnostic, allows you to push content and maybe even experiences into different sorts of applications. It's a very sexy topic right now, a very important topic, as more and more of your customers are going to interact with you through applications as opposed to just marketing websites. We tend to be thinking of this in terms of head optional rather than headless per se, that very often you may want to couple your CMS and delivery environment. In other cases, you don't. Our latest research suggests that although all the vendors claim that they can support this, almost none of them truly support this really effectively for a number of different reasons. So headless right now in the marketplace is really kind of more of a journey than a destination. So, if you look at this from a user perspective, where the user is at the center, obviously there's a lot of digital journeys that they want to pursue that aren't necessarily just through working with your public website. So there's a lot of promise on this whole notion of headless. You just need to understand there's still some key challenges, including understanding in the authoring experience where all this content is getting used if the CMS doesn't actually deliver it, which is important if you're going to update it. How do you deal with preview and simulation? And then what if you want to actually vend out experiences rather than just content? So it's easy to syndicate content to an application. It's a little trickier to actually syndicate a more full-blown, potentially personalized, customized experience. There's a lot of issues around performance, security, context, a whole number of things there that honestly the vendors are just beginning to get a grasp on, but you can find more details about that in our research. Of course, the other key trend is cloud. Here again, at the low end of the marketplace, the product end, you see software as a service, very multi-tenant. For the rest of the market, we've tended to see platform as a service as sort of the dominant model here. And it's working well for a lot of enterprise customers, so that's good. There's some key issues you need to address around who gets to push things into production, who's responsible for what tier in the stack, whether the vendor has some optional add-ons that are SaaS or software as a service based, which might lock you in. The other thing that's really interesting that we're starting to see with some of our larger subscribers is that they already have an existing infrastructure as a service relationship. In other words, they may be already in deep with Amazon and Azure, and maybe even have some sort of quasi-private cloud stuff going on with them, in which case they may want to actually put their WCM tool in that environment rather than a Paas environment. So there's still a play and a case to be made here for infrastructure as a service and software as a service, although the dominant model, at least today, circa 2017, is certainly platform as a service. Okay, so if you want more details on what's going on in the marketplace and what are the pros and cons of the different vendors, I'll commend you to our WCM research, and you can get a free sample of that at any time. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me or Scott directly. Now let's switch gears here and talk about what's the right way to actually select a WCM platform. What I'm going to talk about here is an approach that we call kind of agile-ish, which means that it's based on teams, actual hands-on testing, iterating through a process, and then adapting as you go along to get to the right fit. So it's the non-waterfall approach. We encapsulated this methodology in a new book that's coming out in a couple of months from Rosenfeld Media called The Right Way to Select Technology by myself and my colleague Jared Gingras. And We'll be happy to tell you more about that book when it becomes available shortly. But let's step through the methodology over the next 10 minutes here. So first, you want to build an interdisciplinary selection team. One of the biggest mistakes we see in WCM or really any other technology is where the business and marketing team decides to go out and make a decision on their own, or conversely, the IT team decides what's best, or one of them abdicates responsibility to the other. What you really want is an interdisciplinary selection team that's got your editors and content strategists, digital marketers, other business leaders, and various IT skills and specialties as well, including system administrators, security, developers. Very, very important with these systems because you will be doing some development against them. And really build a holistic interdisciplinary team going forward. Although there should be a business leader who's in charge and obviously a business champion who's owning the whole process. So once you build a team, then you need to go out and look at the marketplace, ideally starting with a kind of a longish short list of maybe 10 to 12 vendors. Then doing some research. Obviously, we're big fans of research. This is what we do for a living. To get down to maybe a short list to whom you would send an RFP or an RFD, a request for demo. And then get down to day-long vendor demos, maybe with 3 to 4 of those. And then the last and most important step is to hold an actual bake-off, which is to bring 2 vendors in each for a week, have them train you in the system, and actually go through your different use cases so you can actually get hands-on. This is one of the biggest mistakes we see is organizations not getting hands-on in these tools before they go ahead and license them. So let's go through each one of these steps. So first, how do you get from a longish list to a short list? Well, there's a variety of different filters you can apply. Certainly in some of our online tools, we use these filters. We're finding these are less and less important, that some of the licensing models are converging. The delivery models are definitely converging in terms of the typical tool being available in a lot of different delivery environments. And technology is still important, but it's interesting how they're less so in this era of growing APIs and REST-based services. It does matter what technical capabilities you have in-house, but on the other hand, if there's a compelling business case or something else, you can often find those capabilities or potentially retrain your staff. So, the big one still is regional. Can you find a regional partner, or does the vendor matter? With many of the larger vendors, like most of the larger vendors that we cover, this is less and less an issue because if they don't actually have a footprint there, very often they have a partner. What's more important about region, of course, is customer communities and meetups and that sort of thing. So region's still very important. So obviously this is one filter. The more important filter that we apply quite a bit during the, when we evaluate these tools and you ought to use in your selection process is what are your usage scenarios. So here's our evaluation of OpenText TeamSite against 10 kind of canonical WCM scenarios. And, obviously it's not scoring so well here. It's an older platform. It's kind of legacy in the marketplace, but really understanding what you need in terms of capabilities and the types of properties that you want to support is obviously very, very important. And I'll come back to usage scenarios in a second here. But the other big consideration here is, some of the vendor intangibles, and in particular, the ecosystem. So we find that the ecosystem and the health and the breadth of the ecosystem around a particular WCM tool is probably the best predictor of its longevity and its overall health. So you want to look for things like user group meetings, active online forums where both customers and vendors and partners are participating, the extent to which you can rely on services partners. So this is a big issue with even some of the up and coming tools like Brightspot or some of the older tools like Crafter, is that they don't necessarily have a lot of services partners. And this is potentially an issue for you because then you're really dependent very heavily on the vendor, and the vendor isn't always good at providing kind of long-term systems integration support. So you can put these all together with a free tool on our site called Real Quadrant. If you're a subscriber, you get access to all the goodies. If you're not a subscriber, you can test it out. And it basically allows you to enter in the scenarios that are important to you, the various filtering around regions and so forth, and then also weight different strategic considerations like total cost of ownership, like the developer ecosystem, like the product roadmap, and then it generates kind of a custom quadrant for you that then can give you a kind of a short list to start out with. So you've got this short list, so then you want to put out an RFP. Now RFPs get, by the way, sometimes called tenders in international English. RFPs have kind of a bad rap. I think that's because they're very often done poorly. In our experience, if you do an RFP really well, you definitely can command attention and make it a vendors and make it a really educational and useful process for you. So let's talk a little bit about the RFP. The one thing you want to do is avoid these sorts of checklist things. The vendors have seen all the checklists. They can check all the boxes. What you really want are narrative user stories, sometimes called journeys or top tasks or scenarios, where you actually show a to-be set of tasks that someone wants to complete. So it could be, in this case, a content editor, could be a digital marketer, could be an end user, a customer, could be a developer trying to implement a new module or a new widget within the WCM, a designer who's trying to change a template. These are all potential user stories, and what you want to do is capture them as a narrative and have the vendor then respond to these as the core of the RFP, have the vendor respond to these if you bring them in for a demo, have the vendor actually prototype these when you bring them in then for a bake-off, have you actually hands-on and test these scenarios. This makes it much more real, much more easy to differentiate than just sort of feature requirements. So again, you want to then bring them through a process, the vendors through a process where you're filtering down and you're adapting along the way, you're changing your use cases as you learn and get smarter, and then ultimately get down to 2, and then you've got a bake-off, and you've got a decision to make. At that point, it's really all about fit, and very often then this becomes a question of trade-offs, right? And this is a very common thing that we help our subscribers with, is sort of helping them measure and evaluate these trade-offs. On the one hand, you have feature, scenario, business fit, but technology fit, obviously very important, partner fit, and value, right? What's the total cost of ownership relative to the benefits that you're getting? And rarely is one perfect, but very often, you know, you can weigh these sorts of things in an open discussion and come to a good conclusion, right? But the point is not to get the best WCM, it's to get the best fitting WCM. Okay, so that's a very rapid look at the methodology that we employ here. Here's some handy links for you if you want to check out that Real Quadrant application. Also the vendor map that you see in the background here, you can download for free, and also get a complimentary sample of our research, including our WCM research, where the sample vendor evaluation is actually Adobe AEM sites. So it's a very interesting platform, very interesting review that you'll see, and I encourage you to go get your hands on it if you haven't seen that already. The other thing that I'll do is remind you that you can ask questions in the GoToWebinar questions panel. And while Scott's just going to wrap up here, I'm going to take a look at these questions. We'll come back to that in a minute. So Scott?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, you can actually try out the Real Quadrant application on your own on our website, along with our real-time and real score tools. But we can also provide you a behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience and get a better understanding of what would be available to you with a subscription. One of those things that actually we offer to our subscribers is advisory time with Tony and the rest of our analyst team as you're looking to make those important decisions at key junctures in your digital technology roadmap. What are the right choices for us to make, and what should we be considering as we're looking to move forward with the vendor? So if that's something you'd like to learn more about, just email us at explore@realstorygroup.com, and we'd be happy to chat with you further about how we can best support your needs moving forward. With that, there are a couple questions here. Tony, did you get those?
Yeah, Scott, thanks. So the first one is from Jeff. got a great question. During the bake-off, would you expect the vendor to charge you for that time? And the general answer on that is yes, Jeff. I mean, we have a whole section on this in our book that's coming out, but it depends a lot on how long the bake-off is. We've done some that are as short as 3 days, in which case the vendor professional services team or even an extension of their sales engineers can come in and do it. For anything that's more involved in that, typically you do need to compensate them, but a couple of caveats. First, in the RFP, ask them for a bid on that in the first place, and make it clear that you're not expecting rack rates. I mean, very often we'll get, a 50% bid on this, so that the vendor acknowledges it's partly a sales expense. The other thing that we see is oftentimes the vendor can and arguably should offer to then remove that cost from any final deal. So if nominally they would charge you $10,000 to do this, if they get the deal, then they credit you that $10,000 against it. Amit is asking, what would be your advice, recommended approach for selecting a full MarTech stack for an integrated digital experience platform? It's not just WCM, but a WCM that works well with campaign system, DMP, DAM. Any advice about how to go do this across the ecosystem, ensure the integrated stack actually makes sense? Well, Amit, I'm going to give you a little bit of a contrarian answer here, which is you should not be selecting the full MarTech stack at one time. It's impossible to do this. You won't have the resources to do this. You should not be getting it all from the same vendor in any case. There is no such thing as an integrated digital experience platform. That's just the reality. So here's what you want to do, Amit. What you want to do is figure out what are the components, the anchors in your mall, the anchor stores. What are the components that are most important, and knock those off first. So whether it's WCM, whether it's DAM, and we have some interesting research on this, how in different types of organizations, different types of experience platforms are really prime, right? Like they're the real anchors. Get the anchors right first, then build around it. Obviously, there's certain standards and use cases around interoperability that can help you. The reality is, going forward, if you do this right, you'll be spending less resources on customization and, yes, more resources on integration. Amanda's got a great question. What are the main reasons people decide to switch systems? Well, Amanda, we have a briefing, a recorded on-demand briefing. You can go back and take a look on our website a couple of months that you can register and download 10 signs you should be leaving your vendor. And so, we've identified 10 reasons. The biggest reason that we see is when it's just prohibitively a bad fit, typically from a complexity standpoint. The tool is way too complex, or somewhat rarer, you've outgrown it totally. I think the bigger issue that we see, particularly in the WCM space, is this notion of these undead tools. That there are tools that haven't gone away, but they're not really thriving or alive either. And at that point, then you have to make a plan for some sort of exit. It doesn't have to be an emergency exit if the tool is still supported, but you do need to have a plan for what's coming next. Okay, so that brings us to the bottom of the half hour. I'd like to thank everyone for participating. It's obviously a really important decision for you, and if we can be useful in any way, please don't hesitate to let us know. So for Real Story Group and Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne signing out until next time. Bye now.